Okay, today we're going to deal with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And we recall, of course, that this particular option is where, or not option, but procedure, and that is where a person has a belief, then comes a belief system, and then an ideology. And this person is very creative. Then comes the anal retentives who legalize and make a system, and then it becomes hardened. And so when we deal with the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda, we have the same formula. It's the same old story where we begin with a very creative, brilliant man named Muhammad, who lived back at I think 670 to, or no, 630 on back to 570. He was a very charismatic man, a born leader, and he united the Arabian Peninsula. And I have no doubt about it that this was a great man. He caused a paradigm shift in a major part of the world. And one way he did it was through monotheism. He knew the Old Testament and the New Testament, and he united the Arabian people, and that spread to Iraq and Iran and Turkey and on way into Europe at one time in history. So Muhammad also, when he was feeling ill in the latter parts of his life, he dictated sections of the Quran. And there's a lot of beauty in the Quran, I have no doubt about it. But then come the legalizers, the system makers, the Sufi Islam, Shia Islam, and Sunni Islam. The Sunnis are in the Arabian Peninsula and scattered into Iraq, and the Shia are predominantly in Iran, and they form the largest number of people in Iraq. But here again we see something that's quite predictable, and that is the Sufis are like the monks or the nuns that go and live in quiet. They are meditative, and they do not get involved in politics. But with the new groups, the Al-Qaeda that was started by Osama bin Laden, and the Taliban, that's had several leaders because several of them have been killed, they have added a new dimension, and that is violence. Violence to anyone that gets in their way. They don't mind shooting babies. They don't mind throwing acid in the faces of women. They don't mind killing children. They don't mind being blown up when they go into a hotel or a meeting because they're going to heaven according to their theology. So we have a new element that the Sufis can't understand, the Shia oppose, the Sunni in Saudi Arabia, they'll kill any Taliban or Al-Qaeda that comes across their borders. And of course, Osama bin Laden said that the kingdom that runs Saudi Arabia is pathological, because that's characteristic of each one of these systems. They always have a devil out there, a straw man, someone who is wrong, and they're standing up for the absolute fundamental truth. These groups, the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda, want to return to the 7th century of Muhammad. And so they're literalists when they approach the Quran. But I won't bother you with saying more of the aspects of these two groups because they are violent. They have decided to use the sword to try and bring back 7th century Islam. Now, one of the things I've said is that when we employ the scalpel, we look at what the other groups say about that particular fundamentalist sect, that obsessional, crazy group of Taliban or Al-Qaeda. Of course, the Sufis and the Sunnis and the Shias talk about how it's a heresy, how it's not the true Islam. And it's just typical of all the other groups, as say the Anglicans or the Congregationalists look at evangelical theology. They show other passages of the Bible in terms of evangelical theology that show love and cooperation, and that salvation is by works and not by faith in some Trinity or God descending from heaven. And in the same way, the more settled Islam faiths combat the Osama's group, the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Now, their presupposition or their assumption is the next thing I do with the scalpel, and that is that violence will return all the peoples to real, true, absolute, perfect, literal Islam. But violence does not work anymore. But that's one of their principles, because there is ultra-violence that can stop it. And I guarantee you, the Chinese, while there are Muslims living in China, will not countenance any Taliban or Al-Qaeda. And you're taking on a huge enemy in China, and Russia is the same way. They don't put up with it. They eradicate, and the Americans try to do that. So then I move to consequences. Of course, each faith is usually developed with young people going through adolescence, where it's real tossy in terms of their own identities. They're trying to separate from home, and the adolescents, the teenagers, are easy converts. And when you tell some sexual boy that he's going to get 28 virgins in heaven, and all he has to do is strap on a vest, push a button, kill people, and then he'll be up in heaven because he's a martyr, you've got a good sell with a teenager who is quite horny. But the consequences is that you're losing young men, and you're killing off good people. The consequences are that you're isolated from the 21st century. You're isolated from the major groups of Islam. So there's a lot of negative consequences. As for the 21st century, the final piece of the scalpel that I mentioned, we can no longer afford that. Violence wins, being tough, strong, muscular, as some people in America keep insisting on in terms of foreign policy. We can no longer afford that. As to how to confront them, I say use the scalpel, 5 elements. But when you're dealing with violence, you also have to respond. So I don't believe in invading Afghanistan or Iraq, where these systems are. I do believe that with all the technology we have, we can use planes, and anytime you see a group forming that's going to war, we can eradicate them with bombs, with cruise missiles, and with the reconnaissance planes, the robotic airplanes. I can't think of the word right now. We can get at them that way. So this concludes my thoughts on just a typical fundamentalist sect, but one that is violent. And violence has to be met with violence by those who are stronger. And so it's not the best of solutions, and it does go beyond the scalpel, but it is the one we have to employ in the 21st century.